A good day to you all. I am Tran Tien Cuong Anthony, 4th year student of St. Paul Seminary and 3rd year professional member of the Clerical Congregation of the Blessed Korean Martyrs. I am Vietnamese. I would like present my thesis with working title, The Korean Martyrs in Marion's Phenomenology of Sacrifice. Its origin title was The Sacrifice of the Korean Martyrs, a Phenomenological Analysis. In proposal defense, the title was changed a little for the purpose in making the title more specific. Panelists recommended the study to add more elements on the framework, caution with redundancy, and to be faithful to the method of synthesis. They guided me to form a clearer the thesis statements. We often find martyrdom in the ancient time and most acts of martyrdom from the Western countries, but it is difficult to find resources in Asia countries like Japan, China, Vietnam, Philippines and Korea. Furthermore, there are some philosophical analyses on martyrdom within Asia or even in Korea, but there is no philosophical analysis on the sacrifice of the Korean martyrs yet. So how can the philosophical concept of martyrdom, especially the phenomenon of Korean martyrdom, be described? Korean Christian martyrs' lived experiences needed to be discussed to understand what their sacrifices were. How can one view on the sacrifice, specifically the sacrifice Korean martyrs? Behind reasons above, researcher has further purpose that it would enrich the literature of the BMC congregation and want to personally understand more the philosophical implications of Korean martyrdom. The following specific problems are established. First, what are the narratives of sacrifice of Korean martyrs as patrons of the BMC congregation? Second, how does Marion articulate the phenomenology of sacrifice? And third, how does Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice enrich the narratives of sacrifices of Korean martyrs? To answer these questions, the following tentative claims are hereby stated. First, the narratives of sacrifice of the Korean martyrs as patrons of BMC are very diverse and profound. They endured many kinds of hardships such as being imprisoned, endured tortures, trials and executions, and finally offer even their lives. Their sacrifices covered all aspects of their human existence, physical, mental and emotional. Second, Marion articulates the phenomenology of sacrifice by presenting his method of reduction to the givenness, the saturated phenomenon, and the very idea of phenomenology of sacrifice. Marion explains phenomenology of sacrifice by method reduction from sacrifice as waste and destruction to sacrifice according to exchange, and arrived the sacrifice as revelation of the givenness. Lastly, Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice allows the narratives of sacrifices of the Korean martyrs to show that all the sacrifices of the Korean martyrs have moral and ethical value, and most importantly their sacrifice can be considered as given or gift. Their sacrifice is that practices a reduction to givenness insofar as it appears as sheer gift rather than an object or being. The sacrifice of Korean martyrs shows the sacredness or holiness of sacrifice in its kenotic sense, driven by one's pure and unconditional love of God. This framework would explain the sacrifice of the Korean martyrs in the light of Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice. First, the exposition of the sacrifice of Korean martyrs in the concept of lived experience which they bear witness based on diversity and profound historical experiences in three categories: martyrs with familial relationship, young and virgin martyrs, and missionary martyrs. Second, the study will discuss about the Marion's phenomenology with method reduction to givenness. Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice is described as reduction from sacrifice as destruction and waste, to sacrifice as exchange, to sacrifice as givenness.
Lastly, relating Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice to the sacrifice of the Korean martyrs.
The discussion is divided into three parts: the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as waste and destruction, the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as aporia, and the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as givenness.
In arriving, the idea the sacrifice of Korean martyrs is unconditional love.
Research structure. In the first problem, the study shall provide historical narrative of sacrifices of Korean martyrs as patrons of BMC with three categories: familial relationship, young and virgin martyrs, and missionary martyrs. Meanwhile, the second problem shall expose Marion's phenomenology with his method reduction to givenness and the very idea phenomenology of sacrifice. On the third problem, the discussion shall relate Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice to the narratives of sacrifices Korean martyrs of the BMC congregation. Lastly, the study will come up with conclusion and recommendation of the research. Scope and limitation. The study concentrates on the sacrifice of Korean martyrs, which focuses on three main categories, namely, martyrs with familial relationship, young and virgin martyrs, and missionary martyrs. This study also focuses on how Marians articulate the phenomenology and arrive at the very idea of sacrifice. The study will no longer deal with other major ideas of Marian in his modern philosophy or theology. This study is significant for all members of BMC, for it will help in understanding the sacrifices of their patron saints. It will be helpful as an encouragement to BMC brothers as inspiration in their training towards understanding martyrdom, and to be witnesses outside of the community and around the world in their missions of daily life.
Moreover, this research work will also make known the philosopher JEAN-LUC Marion, his phenomenology, especially phenomenology of sacrifice. It will contribute the growing number of Marion's philosophical literatures. Furthermore, the study opens a new religious meaning to philosophy, traditionally conceived as adversarial to religion and religious main standpoint, the existence of God. This study is significant in as far as it would give a new meaning to martyrdom among Catholic believers.
The narrative of sacrifice of Korean martyrs as patrons of the clerical congregation of the Blessed Korean Martyrs. It is divided in three categories: martyrs with familial relationship, young and virgin martyrs, and missionary martyrs. At that time, Korea society was Joseon society. It was unique society, for Confucianism controlled all the philosophy and sciences, and the political ideas of everyday life. Parts of their Neo-Confucian teaching are to respect the king, teacher, and parents, and perform sacrifice or rituals to ancestors. The Roman Catholicism arrived in Korea in 1784. The foundation of Korean Catholic Church is unique and special because it was established without foreign missionaries. Not only this, but more significantly for Catholic ecclesiology, it was recognized as a fledgling church before the hierarchy was even proclaimed in 1831 or established in 1836. Christians were actively challenging the unjust social system of their society inspired by Confucian teachings. For them, the gospel was not just only a piece of good religious news, but also good social news. The government officials viewed the Catholic faith as a profane teaching because it denies ancestor worship and the absolute authority of the king and country. These led to persecutions. The Catholic Church in Korea faced 4 violent persecutions nationwide: 1801, Sin-yu persecution, 1839, Kihei persecution, 1845, Byung-o persecution, 1866, Byung-in persecution, and several smaller persecutions. These persecutions led to a huge number of martyrs of about 10,000 who encountered severe persecutions. These martyrs came from various families and of different socio-political statuses, such as provincial governors, royals, court women, soldiers, merchants, pharmacists, widows, clergies as bishop, priest, etc. Their martyrdom acknowledged by the Catholic Church and becomes an everlasting testament of their unconditional sacrifice for the sake of Christian faith. This sacrifice serves as the story that needs to be told to their descendants and unto the world. Martyrs with familial relationship refer to those martyrs who have blood relation, like father with son or daughter, siblings, or even grandfather or grandmother with grandson or granddaughters. Many of the Korean martyrs were blood related. In 103 Korean martyr saints, there were 45 people came from 18 different families that have germane relation. Saint Ju So Sa, Christian name Cecilia. Most of her relatives were martyred, especially 5 of her 8 family members who were also declared martyr by the church. She was arrested and tortured severely and finally expired in prison on a bare ground at the age of 79 on November 23, 1839. Cha Chung Hub, Christian name Peter. The government officials caught him in June of 1839, and he was interrogated and tortured thereafter. His body was twisted 7 times and he was whipped and finally beheaded on December 29, 1839. Just before taken out to the site of his execution, Peter asked a prisoner servant to tell his imprisoned wife and daughter not to shed tears but to praise and thank God. He also encouraged his wife and daughter to follow him in martyrdom. Ji Kwang Hun, Christian name Augustine, had many members in the list of martyrs. His younger brother, his wife Barbara, and his daughter Yi Agatha gave their lives as witnesses of the Christian faith. He changed his whole lifestyle after becoming a Christian. He gave up drinking wine and rarely left the house in order to spend much time meditating alone. He also told his wife and younger brother about the Catholic teachings which eventually led to their conversion. He used his house as a gathering place for Catholics and he became a catechist. He put all his efforts in bringing unbelievers into the church, visiting the sick and caring for their Catholic community. He was caught and the police officers beat him with a triangular club and later beat his buttocks with an oak cudgel. He was bleeding heavily, his flesh was torn, his bones were exposed and cracked from the beating. Augustine was beheaded on May 24, 1839 at the age 53. Young martyrs were those who martyred below the age of 20. The youngest in 103 martyrs was Ju Tae Chul, Christian name Peter. He was only 13 years old when he was martyred. When the prison guard asked him, "Do you still believe in God?" Peter answered, "Yes, I certainly do. I am not afraid of being hit." Virgin martyrs were those unmarried women who had taken a vow of chastity in order to dedicate themselves totally to God and kept their virginity until death. Among 103 martyrs, there are 15 virgin martyrs. Kim Ho-ee says, "We wish to keep our minds and bodies completely pure so that we can serve God faithfully and give Him even greater joy." They devoted their spiritual life by praying, fasting twice a week, reading religious books, praying the Rosary and giving alms to people in need. The Kim siblings were tortured with a red-hot skewer on their backs, removed their clothes and put them in among the male criminals. They desired for God through all their pains. Missionary martyrs are those who have committed to build the church without considering their status. They can be clergies, seminarians or just lay people. They actively did everything as much as possible to evangelize the gospel and to build the church as well as helping believers. Chong Ha Sang Paul traveled long distances to China 9 times with 2,500 kilometers from Korea. He assisted foreign missionaries to Korea with threat that he could be caught and lose his life for such actions. Father Kim Andrew went to Macau, China to study and cultivate his vocation. When came back, he moved mostly at night, teaching and instructing the various Catholic communities. The narratives of sacrifices of the Korean martyrs as patrons of BMC are very diverse and profound. Many martyrs came from same family which germane relation with rich tradition of martyrdom. Many of them were very young age and many virgin martyrs were willing to offer their lives just to keep their body pure or unstained for God. Missionary martyrs actively did everything as much as possible to evangelize the gospel and to build the church as well as helping believers. They endured many kinds of hardships such as being imprisoned, tortures, executions. They finally offered even their lives for the sake of their faith and their love for God. Their sacrifices were of different levels, physical, mental and emotional. The works of Jean-Luc Marion can be divided into 3 interrelated subjects, namely, modern philosophy, phenomenology, and theology. He turns to Husserl and Heidegger and evaluates their own respective phenomenological projects. He addresses the chronological order of phenomenology in history according to the historical time and the order of ideas. The main aim of bringing Husserl and Heidegger in conversation with him has to bring out what Marion thinks to be lacking in their phenomenology. He asserts that Husserl's reduction focuses on object, while Heidegger's reduction fixes itself on existence. What they have forgotten is the primacy of givenness that when examined carefully will provide a broader scope or ground for phenomenological activity. Marion calls this reduction to givenness.
In givenness, he allows the phenomena to give themselves for what shows itself first gives itself.
The first is the Husserlian reduction. It is the transcendental mode of givenness which is the objectness. Marion points out the intentional and constituting of the object which is the constitution of the different modes of objectness. In this reduction, he rejects the participation of the subject, the transcendental I, in the operation of givenness by distinguishing between givenness and intuition.
The second is the Heideggerian reduction.
This is called existential reduction, which sets itself into operation through the existing being or else ontological, and in that it works the question of being. The being according to Heidegger is Dasein. It means being there, or self, myself, yourself. The third reduction is the one that Marion has developed. This reduction is the reduction to givenness that is ultimately to the given, showing itself inasmuch as it gives itself, thus fixing the given in terms ultimate and irreducible by any other reduction. Marion points out that prior to objectness and beingness is the given. This means to say that one cannot claim to have an object or being unless they are being given. This can be understood in the 4 basic questions: to whom? What is given? How it is given. How far? The 3 degrees of givenness are the poor intuition, common phenomena, and the saturated phenomena. In Phenomenology of Jean-Luc Marion, together with Phenomenology of Givenness is saturated phenomena, which is the highest degree of givenness. Saturated phenomenon was developed out of his Phenomenology of Givenness. The saturated is be invisible according to quantity, unbearable according to quality, absolute according to relation, and incapable of being looked at according to modality. The phenomenology of sacrifice is an example of what can be done if one interprets a particular thinker or concept within the phenomenological tradition. He raises in the concept of sacrifice concerns first and above all the act of making something sacred and of snatching it from the profane. He articulates the phenomenology of sacrifice by reduction in 3 levels or senses of sacrifice. Sacrifice is waste and destruction, sacrifice according to exchange, and sacrifice reveals the givenness. In sacrifice is waste and destruction, which is the functional meaning of sacrifice in common sense when one says sacrifice is equivalent to destroying, or to destroying what should not be destroyed. He concludes that the understanding of sacrifice is destruction of a good. It can be reversed by a construction of the self, which sacrifices nothing of itself, save the world to itself. In sacrifice according to exchange, Marion says, sacrifice involves my dispossession, but my dispossession is not enough for sacrifice, which acceptance by the other alone can ratify. Thus, destruction or dispossession and even the horizon of the other still do not allow us to determine a concept of sacrifice. Marion calls sacrifice as exchange as non-truth of sacrifice. Sacrifice ought to consist precisely in giving up without return. Through reduction, Marion lead to sacrifice as revealing the givenness. The sacrifice makes the gift safe and allows it to appear as a gift. Marion illustrates this notion of sacrifice with the biblical story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. He argues that Isaac had been given to Abraham as a completely gratuitous gift from God. That is, Isaac belongs to God first before belonging to Abraham, and the birth of Isaac is a miracle.
He asserts that this is possible only if we admit does not obey the common determination of sacrifice, but its phenomenological concept from the gift reduced to givenness.
Sacrifice is accomplished without destruction. It does not require destruction or exchange. Sacrifice practices a reduction to givenness insofar as it makes appear not objects or beings but gifts. He suggests the sacrifice actually enable a gift to appear in visibility. It makes possible the response to the given in which the gift able to appear together with the giver. Through the story of Isaac's sacrifice, he illustrates that the sacrifice goes beyond the visible gift to givenness itself.
For him, sacrifice is understood not as a matter in a sense of exchange or economic, but something beyond it. It is like a gift that no economic exchange amounts to make the gift possible. Sacrifice is like a gift. It is unconditional, and it does not require return or exchange. It is given freely or gratuitously. Marion goes beyond our common understanding of sacrifice.
In short, Marion explains phenomenology of sacrifice by method reduction from sacrifice as waste and destruction to sacrifice according to exchange, and arrived the sacrifice as revelation of the givenness. Relating Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice to the narratives of sacrifices Korean martyrs of the BMC congregation. The purpose is to deepen our insight and draw deeper inspiration from the narratives of Korean martyrs because they are the patron saints of BMC. Also, aside from this is the philosophical attempt to show in one way or another how Jean-Luc Marion's phenomenological works can be used in various issues and concerns in life. The discussion is divided into 3 parts: the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as waste and destruction, the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as aporia, and the sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as givenness. The narrative of sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as waste and destruction. In the context of Korean martyrs, sacrifice as seen as waste and destruction has a positive meaning. Their sacrifice as a waste is a meaningful waste than a fruitless one. The sacrifice of Korean martyrs was not violent, but the process of undergoing martyrdom is. Violence happened on them. They did not respond to violence nor escape from it even when their body and soul were hurt beyond description. Instead, they embraced violence for a noble cause, for a pure giving of their life for the church. They did not kill anyone, nor did they commit suicide or bomb themselves. Instead, they were victims of violence. Martyrs were those who had lived and died for their love for God and the kingdom of heaven more than anything in the world. They did not do anything wrong or any crime. They were caught, tortured, and even sentenced to death just because they believed in God whom they did not deny. Therefore, the sacrifice of Korean martyrs, unlike the terrorist sacrifice, is not just ethical and acceptable but also exceptional and holy. Many Catholics sacrificed themselves to protect their faith and as such may be seen to be a waste and destruction but nevertheless, meaningful, ethical, and holy. There is one more thing that makes their sacrifice distinguished from others. Martyrs were concerned about the truth of divine revelation, that such truth must be upheld and protected against those who wanted to destroy it. A martyr is willing to die in order for the truth to prevail. These led us to understand that they were not just only victims of mere destruction without meaningful purpose, but also, they were freely and completely gave up their lives to overcome the limit of death. Sacrifice of Korean martyrs. This sacrifice is aporia. The sacrifice of Korean martyrs can also be seen in the light of insight, another view offered by Marion, that is, a sacrifice can be understood as a paradox. Sacrifice is paradoxical in a sense that it can mean both giving and non-giving at the same time. The act gives something but in return also not giving something. One gives one's life in order not to give what one holds dear. The Church considered sacrifice of martyrs as purely selfless and altruistic. The government wanted to persecute Catholic believers by threatening them of horrible persecution. But the more intimidation the government imposed to them, the greater the resistance these Korean converts showed. They sacrificed themselves for the one they loved, or for a higher goal that was participating with the suffering of Christ. For Marion, the martyr's death is embedded in the logic of gratuitousness. In other words, their death symbolizes pure giving without condition. They abandoned their wealth, property, and even families to serve the Church, to help the poor, the sick, and those people in need. This can be seen in the act of self-abandonment or the glory of God in human salvation. On the contrary, some can regard the sacrifice as self-love or self-satisfaction, for the reason that a martyr just sacrificed not for God but for self-love. In this manner, we see another paradox in sacrifice. The abandonment of wealth and property for the sake of faith illustrates self-satisfaction in terms of spiritual dimension. This means that sacrifice really shows both selflessness and self-satisfaction. One has to be selfless in order to gain self-satisfaction or self-love. In Marion's view, one has to love the other first before one can love oneself. Narrative of sacrifice of Korean martyrs vis-a-vis sacrifice as givenness. Sacrifice is neither restitution nor even exchange, much less a contract, because its basis is not economy but the gift itself. It is important to remember that for Marion, gift should be understood not as an economic practice but outside it. However, one should not focus on death as the center of sacrifice but on the givenness itself. That is to say, martyrdom should be seen in a more holistic manner by considering all aspects of such event or phenomenon. What appeared in the narrative of Korean martyrs is that sacrifice is something that is part of their daily life as bearers and witnesses of Christ's faith. The main purpose of their sacrifice is to be living witnesses for others. The lives of Korean martyrs are the evidences of what they understood about God's love. Through Marion's phenomenology of sacrifice, one should not view sacrifice as simply a destruction of the self but as a gift. As a gift, it means that giving without expectation of return or reward. The gift gives without condition according to Marion. We can recognize the sacrifice of Korean martyrs through their authentic attentiveness and self-offering.
To live from a deeper logic that is the logic of the world itself as God's world.
Moving ever closer to God. Sacrifice is the self-emptying of oneself to make room for others, which God filled that self. That is martyrdom of love. Through discussion above, the study comes to conclusion that the sacrifice of Korean martyrs is a sacrifice that practices a reduction to givenness insofar as it appears as sheer gift rather than an object or being. Through Marion's insight, the sacrifice of Korean martyrs has been deepened further. This means that there is so much more to the Catholic Church's recognition of their sacrifice through canonization. The sacrifice of Korean martyrs shows the sacredness or holiness of sacrifice in its kenotic sense, driven by one's pure and unconditional love of God. The arriving at the conclusion that their sacrifice, phenomenologically speaking, is martyrdom of love. The study suggests other aspects variable that could be discussed like foreigner martyrs or clergy martyrs and other categories, or even deeper analysis, or comparison the Korean martyrdom with other nations as Vietnamese martyrdom or Filipino martyrdom as well. The research recommends a further study on Marion's idea in modern philosophy and a deeper study the idea of sacrifice that can be applied to other issues such as the current social, political, moral, and religious. Also to a further study on the idea of martyrdom and sacrifice based on the teachings of BMC martyr saints. May all Korean martyr saints pray for us. Thank you for listening and God bless.